come forward and sit in your designated position. Okay. The chair has distributed to all members excerpts from a current textbooks published by Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Education. The chair would ask and direct that the staff furnish this material to all of the witnesses at this time. Saudi Arabia is an ally in the fight against terrorism. Many of the same terrorist organizations that threaten the United States also desire to overthrow the Saudi government and break our partnership with the government. It's a key member of the coalition to fight ISIS, with its pilots flying alongside Americans since day one of the campaign in Syria. Last year, Saudi Arabia adopted strict laws prohibiting fundraising for terrorism, jointly designated support networks for al-Qaeda and the Taliban. However, the Saudis still have much more they need to do at home to counter the sources of extremism in the region. The battle against terrorism will ultimately have to be fought and won on the battlefield of ideas. Saudi Arabia has simply not done enough to defeat extremist ideology. The kingdom is playing the role of both arsonist and firefighter when it comes to Islamic extremism. Nowhere is this more evident than the textbooks Saudi Arabia produces to teach young people. For too long, Saudi Arabia's education curriculum has inspired the very ideology that is at the root of many terrorist organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda. Saudi textbooks are full of anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and calls to violence that have incited students both at home and across the world. This poisonous ideology has provided the groundwork for generations of extremism. In fact, ISIS adopted official Saudi textbooks for its schools in 2015, until that terrorist organization could publish its own textbooks. However, its export of hateful material through Saudi-funded schools abroad has helped spread the toxic ideology to more tolerant and open Muslim communities in countries such as Kosovo and Indonesia. While the kingdom has repeatedly pledged to remove extremist content from its curriculum, troubling language remains in many of the most recent editions of Saudi textbooks. In 2006, the Saudis committed to eliminate all passages that promoted hatred toward any religion by 2008. Yet even today, years later, textbooks include content that discourages befriending infidels, claims the goal of Zionism is world domination, and encourages fighting any infidel who refuses to submit to the supremacy of Islam. This intolerance is unacceptable and directly contributes to the widespread persecution of religious minorities that plague the Middle East. Another passage in a current Saudi textbook for middle school students states that, quote, Mujahideen who are doing good deeds for the sake of Allah should be given transportation, weapons, food, and anything else that they may need to continue their jihad. Messages such as this undermine the Saudis' own counterterrorism efforts. By indoctrinating children into the belief that the people of other faiths are inferior or that are a threat to Islam, Saudi Arabia is ensuring future generations of extremists that will join the ranks of terrorist groups. This is not to ignore that some positive steps have been taken. In recent years, the kingdom has introduced passages that denounce terrorism and encourage dialogue with other faiths. But these steps are only send mixed messages to an easily influenced young minds, so that as long as there is more extreme messages remain. The State Department has previous in other administrations failed to hold Saudi Arabia counterparts to past pledges. The State Department has even refused to publish reports that shed light on these troubling textbooks for fear of embarrassing our Saudi partners, information that they have in the possession of the State Department. This is troubling. While we appreciate Saudi Arabia's contribution to our overall counterterrorism efforts in the region, we must hold them accountable for their role in fueling the very extremism that we are both trying to combat. It is in both of our countries' interest. In the fight against terrorism, we all need to be on the same page, and that's just the way it is. I'll yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, the ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses that are being here. Mr. Wolf, welcome back. We've dedicated a lot of time in the subcommittee to the topic of countering terrorism and violent extremism. Our last hearing addressed that very issue in Europe in light of the many attacks carried out against so many innocent civilians across the region. We're here to discuss the issue in the context of Saudi Arabia's school curriculum, and in particular, reforms that have been made to ensure children just going to school are not being trained in intolerance and violence, but also importantly, to identify what work still must be done. The spread of extremist ideologies and instances of individuals being inspired to commit acts of terrorism has forced us to learn much more about the factors that make individuals vulnerable to committing acts of violence and taking human lives. We realize that the messages these individuals are exposed to can change the course of their lives and push them to carry out heinous crimes of their own in their own communities, and in those communities they may never be known, but their actions are led to dehumanization, and they actually come to believe legitimate targets of violence are their victims. These materials that our future generations spend every day of the most formative years of their life learning from are therefore very important. Texts that dehumanize and condone violence against others simply cannot be tolerated. Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States in fighting terrorism, and if there's ever to be a lasting peace and security in the Middle East, it'll require every country in the region stepping up and being a leader in eradicating extremism and promoting the institutions and rule of law needed to ensure that such hatred and violent ideologies are never again permitted to take root and to spread. Today, I hope to learn more from our witnesses about the reforms and progress the Kingdom has already made, what existing challenges lie before us, and specifically, how we in Congress can support progress in this regard. Every year that goes by, children are being taught intolerance, and that compounds the challenges we'll face in creating a safer world for them to grow up and going forward. So I'm looking forward to today's hearing about the steps that can be made, to take these materials, molding our future generations and bringing them forward, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in communities around the world. We all have forms of intolerance, and we all must work to remove these from our own countries. This must be achieved as quickly as possible, however. We cannot afford to be patient while intolerance that promotes or condones violence in any form is not only shared but taught and continues to undermine our collective efforts to protect communities from terrorism and violent extremism. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Do any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, without objection, all witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness please keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. If you see a red light that appears before you, that means stop. And we do have your statements, and all members have had access to those statements for some time. I'll introduce each witness and then give them time for their opening statements. Ms. Nina Shay is the director for the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Previously, she was appointed by the United States House of Representatives to serve 7 terms as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Dr. David Weinberg is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Prior to joining the FDD, he served as Democratic professional staff member at the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. The Honorable Frank Wolf served, God bless you, 17 terms in the United States House of Representatives. He is now a distinguished senior fellow at the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative. And Dr. Douglas Johnston is the President Emeritus and founder of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Prior to his current position, he served as Vice President and COO of Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Shay, we'll start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This is an important hearing. It comes at a critical time when Saudi Arabia itself is expressing a new vision for itself of reform. And many thoughtful voices after 9/11 made a connection between the fact that most of the perpetrators and the mastermind behind those attacks were sons of Saudi Arabia, and that their educational system could have a lot to do with what happened that day. The Saudi king back in 2003 convened his own panel to examine the Saudi textbooks, and they confirmed some of our worst fears. And they found that the Saudi kingdom's, and I'm quoting, religious studies curriculum encourages violence towards others and misguides the pupils into believing that in order to safeguard their own religion, they must violently repress and even physically eliminate the other. So 16 years after 9/11, Saudi Ministry of Education textbooks still teach an ideology of hatred and violence against Jews, Christians, other Muslims, such as Shiites, Sufis, and Ahmadiyas, Hindus, Baha'is, Yazidis, animists, sorcerers, and infidels of all stripes, as well as other groups with different beliefs. The most objectionable passages are found in the upper grades religious textbooks. While the Saudi government has made much of reform in the early grades, those religious texts, like those for math or English, have not been particularly problematic, though overall critical thinking and ideas that conflict with the government-approved ones are banned. Each academic year, the Ministry of Education issues a new edition of grades 1 through 12 religious textbooks, and they're mandatory in all Saudi public schools. Each edition reflects some changes in wording, content, and placement. Nevertheless, over the past some 10 years, the content that I have been looking at these books, the content has continued to retain violent passages and directives. Christians, Hindus, and those practicing witchcraft are to be fought and killed. The textbooks incite violence against polytheists, a category that would, of course, include all non-monotheistic religions, but in Saudi Wahhabi teaching can include monotheistic religions too, such as Christianity. Christians are also considered infidels who must be fought unless they have a protection contract with Muslims. Conspiracy theories are taught as fact about the Freemasons, the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, the American University of Beirut, and so on. Dogmatic lessons in Saudi middle and high school textbooks include that instruct that many Muslims should be killed for their beliefs, including blasphemers, Christian converts, and those who merely doubt the Prophet's truth, as well as Shiites and Sufis who are condemned as polytheists for praying or even seen crying at grave sites. No group, however, is more vilified than the Jews. The problem is far deeper than that conveyed by the State Department's characterization of it as simply stereotypical or anti-Semitic language. Repeatedly, Jews are demonized, dehumanized, and targeted for violence. The textbooks instruct that the Zionist aim is Jewish domination of the world and controlling its destiny. When I was in Saudi Arabia in 2011 with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I had a chance to ask the Saudi Justice Minister at the time why the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an infamously anti-Semitic fabrication from the Russian Revolution, is included in the textbooks on Hadith, which is the traditions of Islam's Prophet Muhammad, where it continues to be taught as historical fact. He responded that the protocols are treated as part of Islamic culture because it is a book that has long been found in plentiful supply in Saudi Arabia, and that it was a book that his father had in his home. In the interest of time, I'm going to refer to my written testimony for specific examples. You've already cited a few. But just to say that apostates are singled out for punishment in this life, death, unless they repent within 3 days. The Christians, again, are considered polytheists, and polytheists are to be, is a reason to fight those who practice it and to commit jihad against it, is another quote from these books. Homosexuals, the punishment is death. Jihad is extolled and defined, its first definition is exerting effort in fighting unbelievers and tyrants. And there are many more examples. And these are posted on the internet and shipped worldwide. And they have been linked by our counterterrorism officials to growing extremism. The Saudis, the one point I'd like to make is that the Saudis themselves have admitted that the textbooks need reform. They do not deny it. Any Saudi that I talked to has agreed, including the Saudi Minister of Education in 2011, but they have not really finished it. They've never finished it, and they have a long history of broken promises where they have said that they did, either they did clean them up, as our ambassador to Washington, our former ambassador to Turkey, Al Faisal, told us, and, or that the reform is just around the corner and that it will be completed in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. And over this period, it has not happened. The government, U.S. government has failed to verify this and has even, as you mentioned, covered up. So I will conclude my testimony there and urge you to mandate that Congress mandate the State Department review the textbooks and highlight and detail the troublesome portions of it, and to even to make defense contracts with Saudi Arabia contingent on the cleanup of these textbooks, and so that they are not in danger of hurting or killing any American that might be a member of the group that are singled out for violence and demonization in its reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. Dr. Weinberg.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies for having me here today. I will deliver an abridged version of my written testimony. As I explain in that text, encouraging Saudi Arabia to remove incitement from its government-published textbooks for its public education system is not just the right thing to do. It's also a national security issue. Fighting terrorists militarily can only achieve so much if Saudi textbooks and other sources of incitement continue to provide fertile intellectual ground for violent extremism. This past May, I published a long list of intolerant statements in Saudi textbooks from the most current school year, which I will draw from extensively here. I have included all of these passages in their original Arabic as an appendix to my written testimony. I found that Saudi textbooks still recommend killing people for many acts that US law would characterize as personal choices. That included adultery, anal sex, converting from Islam, or purported acts of sorcery. The textbooks are also rife with anti-Christian and particularly anti-Semitic incitement, often framed as anti-Zionism. One book called Christianity, an Invalid, Perverted Religion. Another accused Zionism of plotting a global Jewish government, and a third called Zionism an octopus, that it accused, falsely, of trying to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the entire Islamic creed. A fourth book taught that befriending infidels is forbidden, citing a Quranic verse that says not to take Christians or Jews as allies. That textbook called such infidels enemies of Muslims and of God, and taught that Muslims must abhor them, quite literally teaching hatred. These are all examples from current textbooks used in the 2016 to 2017 Saudi school year. According to a forthcoming report by Human Rights Watch, the textbooks also repeatedly refer to well-known stereotypes of Shiite or Sufi Muslim rituals as horrendous examples of polytheism. This is particularly important because a passage I found in a current Saudi textbook called for fighting such polytheists, except under a handful of extenuating circumstances. That book also teaches that there are 4 types of infidels, and that if a non-believer doesn't happen to fit into one of the first 3 categories, diplomats, peoples with whom Muslims have a non-aggression treaty, or people who agree to pay a special tax associated with second-class status, then they are combatants, whom it says Muslims are commanded to fight. Saudi Arabia has made some positive changes to its textbooks in recent years, but not enough. A few passages condemning terrorism or racism and permitting kind treatment of peaceful non-believers have been added. Direct calls to violence or hatred are somewhat less common. By the way, I'd like to share a little bit of news with you today. 17 minutes after this hearing was scheduled to start, the Saudi embassy posted on Twitter that, quote, "The Ministry of Education has finalized a round of textbook revision in line with the objectives of the National Transformation Plan," end quote. This is particularly puzzling because in an interview with the Wall Street Journal earlier this year, Saudi Arabia's education minister seemed to suggest that the broader change involving incitement and other issues in the curriculum would have to wait until up to 3 years from now, when the kingdom would move to tablets in the classroom. Saudi officials routinely oversell the success and ambition of their efforts to reform these books to date. In 2005, Saudi Arabia said it had removed all the problematic passages from its textbooks. When Nina Shay proved that that was incorrect, the Saudis assured the US that all intolerant passages would be removed by 2008. They missed that deadline, as well as others they had pledged for 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. Even some of the textbooks they claimed to have fixed in recent years still contain incitement. US policy on this issue has not been up to the task. For example, the State Department issued the country reports on counterterrorism today. And while there are several lines in there about the Saudi curriculum, there's only less than a full sentence on what incitement still remains. But there is much that Congress can do to help. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom called on the executive branch this year to, quote, "undertake and make public an annual assessment," end quote, of Saudi textbooks to, quote, "determine if passages that teach religious intolerance have been removed," end quote. Congress should help by passing legislation that requires the administration to issue such a yearly report and allocates resources for it to do so, no later than 90 days after the start of the Saudi school year, so such findings are actually still valid for diplomats. And such a report should quote all such passages that could be seen as encouraging violence or intolerance for public scrutiny. There are a number of other recommendations that I include in my written testimony, but in the interest of time, I will leave off there.
Thank you, Dr. Weinberg. The chair will now recognize Congressman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The issue of Saudi's educational curriculum as a means of promoting intolerance and inspiring terrorism is not a new one. This topic hit close to home in 2003 when Abd Omar Abu Ali was arrested while in class at the Islamic University of Medina for an attempted plot to assassinate President Bush. Before attending the University of Medina, Mr. Abu Ali was a valedictorian of a high school which was located here in Northern Virginia, the Islamic Saudi Academy. Mr. Abu Ali was ultimately sentenced to life in prison and is currently serving out a sentence in a supermax in Colorado. The reason I like to highlight this particular case in particular is due to the fact that concerns were raised regarding the educational material being used by the Islamic Saudi Academy over and over. Not only was the school funded by the Saudi Arabian embassy, which meant it fell under the Saudi Ministry of Education, but the Saudi ambassador to Washington led the board of directors. He literally led the school. In 2007, when asked by the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom to make textbooks publicly available, the school refused to comply. We got copies from a professor that gave us them on the side. One letter from USERF on the issue stated, based on past documentation, significant concerns remain about whether the Saudi textbooks used at the ISA Academy explicitly hate, intolerance, and human rights violations, and in some cases violence, which may adversely affect the interests of the United States, end of quote. In 2008, I wrote Secretary Rice on 5 different occasions regarding the concerns held by the Commission regarding the content of the textbooks. At that time, I requested a meeting be convened between relevant State Department officials, USERF representatives, and expert analysts commissioned by USERF to translate the textbooks in order to determine what was being taught by the Academy. Such meeting never took place. Generally, the State Department has been weak on this issue in both Republican and in Democratic administrations. During this time, USERF was finally able to obtain copies of some of the textbooks being used by the Islamic Saudi Academy. After a thorough analysis, the commission concluded that the textbooks contained very troubling passages that did not conform to international human rights standards, including vilification of those who adhere to Christianity, Judaism, Baha'ism, Ahmadiyism, and Shia Islam, and others. I've submitted for the record some of those statements. And in 2009, I sent a letter again to Secretary of State Clinton urging the State Department monitor and report on the textbooks published by the Saudi government. In that letter, I acknowledge, to date, we have had only vague assurances on the part of the State Department and the school that the curriculum has been reformed. But these assurances are insufficient, particularly when they're utterly at odds with the USERF findings and may be indicative of a wider problem, namely the status of Saudi commitment made in 2006 to conduct a comprehensive revision of textbooks, education, curriculum to weed out. While it's impossible to say that Mr. Abu Ali was directly radicalized by the textbook used at the Islamic Saudi Academy, the use of the books that promote religious discrimination and the justification of violence toward non-believers cannot be tolerated, certainly not in Fairfax County, not in Virginia, not in America, but quite frankly, anywhere around the world. Consider that if this academy's curriculum in the United States, just imagine how prolific the problem has been across Saudi-affiliated academies, funded programs in other countries around the world, especially in some countries in the Middle East. While Ahmad Omar Ali case is now almost a decade old, Saudi Arabia has continued to promote and export radical Wahhabism. In the wake of the Orlando shooting just last year, Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton stated, quote, "It's been long past the time for the Saudis, the Qataris, and Kuwaitis and others to stop their citizens from funding extremist organizations, and they should stop," she said, "supporting radical schools and mosques around the world have set too many young people on the path toward extremism." And unfortunately, by funding top American university research centers, the Saudi government has been able to minimize voices of those in academia who you would have thought otherwise would have had the best means for researching the effects of radical Wahhabism. While there are many concerns regarding the influence of Saudi Arabia, more specifically radical Wahhabism, on countries around the world, it would be remiss not to acknowledge that very recently some small improvements have been made to the educational material. In the latest report by USERF, they said in February 2017, Saudi officials stated that the final stage of revisions to high school texts was underway. During its visit, USERF obtained some textbooks currently in use and found some intolerant content remain in high school texts, though at a reduced level. They go on to explain while there has been progress in terms, there is still concern that some of the teachers may be promoting a more radicalized version of Islam. Some recommendations. One, the USERF has some very good recommendations. Undertake and make public an annual assessment. I believe you have to put this into legislation. If you just let the State Department or the American Embassy in Saudi Arabia, they will always find a reason not to do it. So I think it needs to be mandated that the relevant Ministry of Education textbooks determine if passages that teach religious intolerance have been removed. Secondly, press the Saudi government to denounce publicly the continued use around the world of older versions of Saudi textbooks and other materials that promote hatred and intolerance, and to make every attempt to retrieve and buy back previously distributed textbooks that contain intolerance. You know, even in American schools, sometimes you go in a class, there'll be a textbook that's 10, 15 years old. These are still in schools around the world. Keep in mind, lastly, the Saudis funded almost all of the madrasas that were up on the Afghan-Pakistan border that helped lead to what took place in the Taliban. Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, was a graduate of a Saudi-funded academy. The issue needs more work, and I want to thank the subcommittee and the members, because I kind of thought for a while this issue was kind of forgotten about. Mandate it and put it in. If you take the pressure off, the Saudis will slip back in and this will come in. You keep the pressure on and you can make a tremendous difference. I thank you for the hearing.
Thank you, Congressman Wolf. Dr. Johnston.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you for the honor of presenting to your committee some of the work our center's been doing to try to help facilitate educational reform in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We have a written testimony that covers that comprehensively. I'll just touch on some of the highlights. Before I do, though, I would like to just take 1 second to honor the other witnesses here. Each is a champion of human rights and religious freedom in their own right, and it's an honor to be with them. Our task, which I consider complementary to their own, has been to take action to address the problem. And in 2011, we received a grant from the State Department to develop recommendations that would help facilitate reform efforts that were already underway in the kingdom. Toward this end, we assessed all of the textbooks for discriminatory content, and we also tried to determine the global dispersion of those textbooks. It was from the start, our approach was one of seeking to be balanced, giving them credit for whatever progress had been made, not only in that, but in their de-radicalization program, but to be very unsparing in our detail of what yet remained to be done. And there we completed a report. It's very comprehensive, included 99 textbooks. I could go into great length on that, but just suffice it to say that this report is just replete with examples of the kinds of problems that have been cited here with the other witnesses. There is, at that point in time, this is 2011, sprinkled throughout, you would find direct license given for violent behavior toward others who do not subscribe to that similar brand of Islam. You also find direct license for such things as desecrating the tombs of the Sufi saints in Timbuktu, which the extremists did before the French kicked them out. So there were lots of problems. There were not only problems in the textbooks as a whole, but even in the 6 grades that had already been thoroughly revised, we did find problems. So one of the things I would just point out, though, in terms of looking at these things, I think it's important to try to avoid using a Western lens as you do so. By that, I mean what we tried to do is hold their feet to the fire by comparing what's in those textbooks to what's in the Holy Quran with respect to that same subject area, what's in the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights and Islam with respect to that. In all cases, the Saudi textbooks were much more conservative than the sources I just mentioned. So that's a very important piece, is just understanding exactly where, how much freedom the government of Saudi Arabia has to really maneuver. There's so many wild cards in the mix. There are charities through which textbooks are distributed. There are maverick members of the royal family. There are deep-pocketed Saudis who are not members of the royal family. Lots of people with lots of agendas. And one of the things that's also a bit of a constraint is the fact that the original pact between the monarchy and the Salafi ulama called for education belongs to the religious establishment. So one of the things that the Saudis are having to do is to finesse that aspect, that obligation. They also need to worry about the credibility that they maintain within Islam itself as custodian of the 2 holiest sites. So this is not to forgive any of the textbook content. This is to just explain why sometimes it may take a little bit longer than we would like. We established a comprehensive baseline for future analysis, and we felt that the progress that the Saudis were making was credible enough that we should probably keep the report private, not release it to the public. Our concern was that Western critics seizing upon the offensive passages that still remained might just shut down the whole process as a defensive backlash sets in and the conservatives moves in. We've seen this time and again in different situations in the Islamic world. So we spent the next 3 years implementing some of the recommendations that we had come forward with. Now, just to bring it right up to the present, we're in another month, we're going to be starting a new effort to look at the textbooks of the high school grades, which had not been revised the last time we looked at them. We're also going to take an in-depth look at 3 countries on how the Saudi educational materials are affecting the religious and social. What is that impact? And I will say this: right now, the Saudis claim to have just completed that process, reform process that started way back in 2007. And they realized, however, that they still have problems. Many of those have been mentioned here right now. And what they are planning to do is tackle it from 2 aspects. One is by 2020 to have developed a set of curriculum standards. They've never had curriculum standards before. And this is part of their National Plan on Educational Reform, which was articulated in 2014, $22 billion behind it. It's very serious money. That money has stayed protected even during their budget shortfalls. And by these curriculum standards, they will then revise wholesale the content in all of the textbooks. In the meantime, on a more urgent basis, they're going to be looking at the current revised textbooks, and starting within 3 months, they will start making changes on a priority basis. And they will have these completed, according to them, by the next school year, 2018 to 2019. And there is so much going on right now. They're going to, in 3 years, they will have converted from textbooks to tablet computers. So there's a lot of change underway. I believe that the commitment is real, and they certainly do understand the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnston. The chair recognizes itself for some questions. I want to be clear that when we're dealing with Saudi Arabia, it's not all or nothing. Like I said earlier, they're the arsonists, but they're also the firefighters when it comes to terrorism. That's what makes this very troubling, this whole issue. Ms. Shay, let me start with you. If I understand correctly, Saudi Arabia agreed in 2006 that they would fix this problem, and they would have it all fixed by 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
they
we're
did.
claiming my time because I only have a few minutes. So here it is now, 9 years later, and it's still not fixed. Maybe some progress, but it's the issue that they promised in 2006 to fix the textbooks has not come about. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So that's 9 grades. That's almost a generation of students that they furnished the textbooks to that are still receiving this, in my opinion, violation of human rights. Saudi Arabian schools teach religion, and it is mandatory that all students go to these religious classes. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is where these textbooks are used.
Yes.
And they're not only used in Saudi Arabia, but they're used in other places in the world, including in the United States, as Congressman Wolf has stated. Is
They
that
have
right?
about 20 schools that they directly run, and then they're spread. For example, Dr. Johnston's report said that there were 150 schools that Saudi Arabia established in Burkina Faso alone. So that gives you some idea of the scale. It's all over the world, all continents, and where there are people, where there are Muslim communities, and not everyone is receiving Saudi textbooks, but many, many are.
And some say that the radicalization in Kosovo and Indonesia are a result of these textbooks being in these schools. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am. I hear it all the time.
Congressman Wolf?
Yes.
Dr. Johnston, I know the State Department contracted with your group to study this issue, gave a grant, American taxpayer money, a grant for y'all to study the issue. You studied it, you got a report there in your hand, but the State Department still to this day refuses to release to the public that report. Is that correct?
No, that's not true, sir.
So they have released the report.
They have, but not on their own doing.
It's been released because somebody leaked the report.
No, it was because the New York Times used the Freedom of Information Act to get a copy of the report.
So it's been,
It
the
is.
public does have access to your entire report.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. I did not know that. Congressman Wolf, let me ask you, you mentioned a few things that must be done. This has been going on for a good number of years, and where we are today, I think the United States, this is just my opinion, doesn't want to endanger the sensitivities of our relationship with our Saudi allies. How would you characterize this relationship and the demanding that that they change their textbooks?
Well, it goes up and down, and during the area of oil crisis, nobody wanted to offend the Saudis. America is back becoming basically energy independent. I think what you're doing with a hearing today, by bringing the attention to, there ought to be the new U.S. ambassador for religious freedom, the person whose name I've heard is a very outstanding person who will be very good on this issue. The subcommittee should meet with that person. Thirdly, you ought to have questions gone over to the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. When they send the name up of the new ambassador, there'll be very tough questions from both sides of the aisle. This is not a political issue, if you will, aggressively putting him on record or her on record, whoever it is, that they will speak out. Lastly, when he or she is confirmed, this subcommittee ought to meet with them. And I think the more you pressure and do it publicly, in a very respectful way, you have to be careful, though, because the Saudis put a lot of money in different universities. They also hire prominent law firms in town. I couldn't believe 3 weeks ago, a prominent law firm was hired to represent Bashir, an indicted war criminal, indicted for genocide, responsible for the death of 200 to 300,000 people in Darfur, bombing people in the Nuba Mountains, and yet a law firm, prominent law firm, working for him. So you have to be careful that there isn't pressure. But what you've done today, following up with it, I don't think the State Department will aggressively do it unless the Congress pushes them.
Last question, Dr. Weinberg. You mentioned that 17 minutes into this hearing, that was a public notice that we were having this hearing, the Saudi Arabians did something. What did they do?
So they announced on social media that a new round of curriculum revisions had been completed, which again needs to be not a justification for letting scrutiny off, but a justification for added scrutiny to see if they've actually delivered on what they pledged. If I could just add my voice to what the Honorable Mr. Wolf said about envoys. In addition to encouraging the administration to nominate a qualified individual for the congressionally mandated post of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, there are 4 other important positions that are laying vacant on this issue right now. There is currently no nominee, at least as of last I checked 2 days ago, for U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. It should be somebody with real experience in the relationship and not just business experience. Additionally, there is no nominee for the special representative of the State Department to Muslim communities abroad, a crucial vacancy. Additionally, there is still no nominee for the anti-Semitism envoy at the State Department, and the Secretary of State even suggested that such a nominee might be counterproductive for addressing anti-Semitism by taking it out of the priorities of the State Department, which I think is a deeply counterproductive perspective. And then lastly, there's the position of ambassador or special envoy for religious freedom of minorities in the broader Middle East, a position that is mandated by Congress, there is somebody serving in this capacity, but not with the level of seniority that Congress has mandated. So those are all areas where you all can have an important voice.
4 positions, 4 witnesses. I think maybe we can solve that problem right here. I'll yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Johnston, you mentioned that the center is moving forward and they're looking at 3 countries to see what the do an in-depth examination of the religious and social impact of Saudi educational materials in those countries. Can you tell us and expand on what countries were chosen and what reason were those countries included in the study?
They have not been chosen. We are currently examining the feasibility of securing memorandums of understanding with selected governments that would pass this test. These are going to be 3 countries of strategic consequence. They will be drawn from the Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe.
Could you share any timetable that you might have?
I would say that we would have this firmly underway within 2 months. I would say too, and I'm sorry that time didn't permit this earlier, but in response to our study on the global impact, the Saudis actually put out a request to the cultural attaches of every one of their embassies around the world, encouraging them to, directing them to retrieve any old textbooks that might be in use within their respective geographic areas and to replace them with new. The problem with that, of course, is the new still have problems, but this is to just show you that they're not deaf to the issue of this stuff going worldwide. And one of the things we're trying to do is just to impart a sense of ownership on all of that, and I think they're stepping up to the plate.
Well, 9 years, they might not be deaf, but they're slow of hearing, I would say.
It's glacial.
In respects. Certainly. And one of the concerns, too, when we're looking at this overall problem and the expansion of these materials, I think a lot rests on the control that the home country has on its education curriculum. I think Ms. Shay mentioned Burkina Faso and Mali. Now, how much are countries like that reliant on these Saudi materials financially, what their control is? And this should seem to me an opportunity for the United States to try and deal with this directly. What opportunities could we have in those countries if they're reliant on money and resources for a curriculum from Saudi Arabia, which we're learning today, still contains material that's not appropriate, to say the least. So tell us about what your views are, the impact of those home control countries on the curriculum.
Yeah, it's very determinant. I even spoke to an imam from a mosque in the United States about who had Saudi textbooks in his library that he made available in school, and he has since removed it. He said, but he said that the reason why was that he was working with an immigrant community that was impoverished and that they did not have a school, they did not have textbooks, they did not have religious textbooks. So they turned to the country in the world with the deep pockets for such things. So
Could I interrupt and just say that given the U.S. interest here, isn't that a priority for our country perhaps? Is there an opportunity, or would they not be receptive to the United States?
Well, it's going to be very tricky the United States cannot be funding religious things like that.
How about through NGOs or funding through NGOs or anything like that? There's just no.
Well, I think the solution again is to press the Saudis to clean up their textbooks because they're going to be online.
Well, if the Saudis are so sincere about this, what are they doing currently to the current generation and the prior generations that have been so indoctrinated in this material? Have they done anything in a remedial nature to deal with this whatsoever?
Well, one of the things they did in their de-radicalization program was that they fired 3,000 imams. They retrained 20,000 others out of a total pool of 75,000 imams. So that's taking care of it within their own borders. Beyond that, the question that you asked, where they have paid for the mosques and all the rest of it, you find in most countries they have significant control over what's taking place in the schools. Again, I would just point out there's an important caveat here. That may not be the government of Saudi Arabia. Very easily, it's these, you peel back the onion, it's very difficult to follow.
If I could,
But-
just because
but
my
in more
time's about to expire, if I could just, and you could have your chance if the committee gives us a little bit of an expansion here. Congressman Wolf mentioned some of the things directly. He gave specifics about what the U.S. could do. Just in a very short summary, if any of you have specific ideas, I'd like to hear them.
So on the topic of exportation that we were just discussing, one thing that has always plagued this issue, and this was a challenge for that New York Times investigation that the chairman was discussing. I spoke with some of the reporters who were involved in that and related efforts at the Times, and one of the challenges when it comes to studying this exportation issue is there's often only anecdotal data, or it's very vague and impressionistic. So one of the things that the U.S. government can do to really play an important role here is to use all the assets of the U.S. government on this, and in particularly the intelligence community. The easiest thing, or the most important thing that can be done in terms of informing this debate would simply be a directive from Congress to the intelligence community to monitor the exportation of incitement from Saudi Arabia, including but not limited to textbooks, and to direct them to report on this. Additionally, Congress can call for rebooting the U.S.-Saudi strategic dialogue with a track to include issues related to incitement. And that rebooting, in a general sense, is something that the new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is reported to support. And then additionally, Congress can publicly and privately raise this issue, as well as urging the president to do so and to issue a formal directive to U.S. agencies and cabinet members to do so as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Weinberg. In respect to my other committee members, if you could do that in writing.
Do
any
you want any
suggestions
more
would be
ideas?
helpful. We might, but I have to be respectful of the other committee members unless we have a second round. But anything like that, I think the committee would appreciate in writing. And also, the committee is aware, perhaps, that there is classified material along the lines that Dr. Weinberg suggested that they may want to review, something that I think the committee might be interested in doing. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel here. Mr. Weinberg, you mentioned a report in your testimony, or maybe in question, I can't remember, but what's the report going to do? What's it going to do to Saudi Arabia, and what's it, said report, so to speak, what would it do to the United States?
So one of the challenges of this issue to date is something that Ms. Shay addresses in her written testimony, which is the tendency of the State Department, because its priority is maintaining constructive relations with Saudi Arabia and advancing a range of other issues in the bilateral relationship, such that they usually don't want to rock the boat, that a long-term strategic priority for the United States, like textbooks, doesn't get raised in the immediate term when it needs to get raised, and it gets kicked down the road indefinitely. So as a result, State Department language on this issue every year in their International Religious Freedom Report, in their Human Rights Report, as well as in their country reports on terrorism, such as the one that came out today, basically have a throwaway line or two about some incitement still remaining without providing any specific examples typically, or at least without providing direct quotations. And so,
Isn't this like widely known? Like, doesn't the whole world, like, we all know this, right? Everybody in the room knows this. With all due respect, I just, look, a report might be nice, but I don't see it moving the ball, quite honestly. Yeah. I mean, maybe in the panoply of everything you're going to do, that you have to add that, but.
If I could play devil's advocate for a moment. So part of the challenge with this issue has been the absence of current data when people actually have their conversations with Saudi officials. So for example, the important study that Mr. Johnston's institute did, its results were not raised with Saudi officials by them or by the U.S. government,
but
to the best of my knowledge, until the books were already obsolete.
That's an issue of will, not of information. Man, I got textbook excerpts right in front of me here. So,
but the reason those excerpts were done Until May, most of those excerpts were not actually in the public sphere because nobody had gotten access to the books and sat down and read them and transcribed these.
You're
So
telling me
for
that
several
we
years, people
legitimately,
didn't know.
and I'm not trying to be bellicose or difficult, but you're
Yeah.
telling me we had no physical evidence like
Correct.
this until May of 2017.
For this academic year, yes. And
Oh,
so-
for this academic year,
Right,
but
and
we
so the
have for every
Saudis-
other academic year back to 1970, 1980 or
But
something.
just like that tweet from the Saudi embassy that we were discussing, the Saudi government every year claims that this has been seriously worked over, and so the stuff that people are concerned about is old news. And so it's important
Well,
for
of
the
course,
U.S.
that's
government to make-
propaganda. I mean, you can listen to Russia TV and Al Jazeera as well if you want to believe all that stuff. But I mean, I'm hoping Americans are a little brighter than that. Let me ask anybody this regarding incitement, because I just don't feel like we ever go far enough, and I'm not sure even the suggestions I've heard go far enough to suit me. That's just me. But does anybody know whether incitement, when you talk about the penalty for the adulterer who has previously consummated a marriage is stoning to death, that's in the book, or apostasy, the penalty for apostasy is killing. That's in the textbook. I don't know if this is incitement in the classic example or case, and I don't know if it meets the Brandenburg test. Does anybody know if it does? Have we ever tried to? I mean, nobody wants to get into the suppression of free speech. But at some point, free speech crosses over the line into incitement. Now, I guess the test is intended, likely, and imminent, at which the courts at some point decided what imminent was. Does anybody know whether that's ever been challenged? Have we ever taken a shot at it? Does the government have an interest? Okay.
Well,
Yes, ma'am.
I think we have done that in the case of Americans who have posted such death threats against, like, for example, the South Park cartoonist who did an irreverent cartoon of.
But I'm talking about the textbooks. Is
But
this,
no, I
does
mean,
this-
I don't
is this
see how that
considered
could-
incitement?
I don't see how that could be. I don't see how there's diplomatic immunity. I don't see how the Saudi
The
textbooks.
textbook has diplomatic immunity?
Well, they're published by the government of Saudi Arabia, who would be held responsible. The Ministry of Education of Saudi Arabia is the printer, and the government of Saudi Arabia
So
is
if
the
the
sponsor.
government of Saudi Arabia publishes information that says that every citizen that has an affiliation with Saudi Arabia living in the United States should kill the next American they see, there's nothing we can do about that? Like we can't have that removed from the shelf because it's the government of Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, we've pressed people who actually carried out the crime, but.
But incitement, there have been prosecutions for incitement in advance of the crime based on incitement, right? The question is to anybody's knowledge, has anybody in the United States, on behalf of the United States, pursued that avenue regarding the textbooks and the passages therein as incitement?
Some of the 9/11 victims' families may have been suing Saudi Arabia for reparations for that. But I don't know what the theory of their case was whether it was the education
It seems like
system.
maybe either the answer is no or unknown, so maybe that's a place we can delve into further. Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. The chair will have one more round of 2 minutes per member. I'll yield my time initially to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts, for his questions.
Mr. Weinberg said one of the things that we can all do is speak up more and be consistent in doing it at every level. Taking into consideration what Congressman Wolf said, there's generations of leaders before this, both sides of the aisle, that haven't been aggressive enough, as he testified. However, President Trump was just in Saudi Arabia. President Trump was talking about extremism and the need to band together to do it. Yet there's no report that he brought this issue up in the course of that. What is the danger in not bringing this up, particularly at that level, particularly under that theme?
Yeah, so this is the challenge is that the president almost never raises the issue. This was the case with President George W. Bush. This was the case with President Obama. This appears to be the case with President Trump, which is part of why the strategic dialogue was inaugurated between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia under the Bush administration so that senior officials could still raise priority concerns when it didn't rise to the level of the commander-in-chief as their number 1 or 2 or 3 priority, but still needed to be addressed because of U.S. interests. But that having been said, that's not an excuse for the president not to address it. It's not an excuse for the president not to direct cabinet members to do so as well. President Trump, when he participated in the inauguration of a global center for combating extremist ideology in while he was in Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, was in the works for 2 years, and then they repackaged it to be a deliverable during this summit, he predicted it would make history. Reflecting on his visit to the kingdom several weeks later, he urged all nations to stop teaching people to kill other people, stop filling their minds with hate and intolerance. And he said he would not name other countries besides Qatar. Now, I actually have an article draft forthcoming which explains why Qatar's record on counterterrorism issues is actually worse than all of its other neighbors in the Gulf monarchies. But that having been said, the books need to be addressed directly with knowledge on a regular basis, with current information about the current school year, or else it's not going to have any impact with the Saudi government. Otherwise, the Saudi government is going to keep doing what it's doing, which is reprinting these books year after year with incitement and indoctrinating at least several more years of students with this problematic information.
May I correct the record on something? This report was, in fact, I briefed the Saudis in Riyadh on this report. It was sent over through diplomatic channels as well, and out of that came one ray of hope. We worked for several years on one of the recommendations, which was to bring Saudi educators together with American educators to deal with the problem of bias and intolerance in national education systems. Out of this came a series of recommendations to their government and our own, but to their government, which I delivered to their Minister of Education. One of the things I feel is so important, and hasn't been mentioned here, but far more important than these textbooks, far more important, is the teacher training. And we have opportunities now to be able to go over there. And in the context of this national plan for educational reform, which was crafted mostly by McKinsey and Company, it is a dynamite plan. And if they fully implement it, it will actually leapfrog some of our own habits. But I think the door is open that we could go and help them implement this, and particularly get at the teacher training, which is, as I say, far more important.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson, I understand one of the problems for the United States is how the actions, the statements versus actions coming from Saudi Arabia are determined. And I indeed asked the Secretary about the metrics to determine efficacy of the Saudis' actions and how we're measuring their progress. I will tell you now, look, the man's been on the job for 4 or 5 months, right? So you have to give him some leeway, but I didn't get a lot of confidence that anything meaningful was there, and I actually wonder some of the officials who may be determining what the efficacy is, literally, that might be, I hate to say it, but so to speak, working for the other side. So in your work with the ICRD, how would you categorize the metrics we use and who's determining? Is it appropriate, or is that problematic that needs to be addressed, and where is that addressed?
No, I think one of the metrics is the baseline that we established here back in 2011. To be sure, we haven't looked at those books in 5 years, but the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom did several years ago. We provided them the baseline. They determined that further reform was taking place, and in this year's annual report, they even talk about a visit there in February of this year where they determined that more reform was taking place. So this is a metric. We're going to be looking very hard at it starting in another month on the high school grades. That's where most of the onerous content exists. And one of the other things in terms about why this is so slow is they took a full year to field test their revisions to the 10th grade, which was, as far as we were concerned, was the one grade where it was the worst. And they did those revisions. I don't know what's come of that. We will find out. But they took a full year to test it. And the other thing we have to remember is that a lot of this is getting in on religious ground. And some of that's pretty safe.
But I think they use that and good for them, I suppose. But
Sometimes,
it
yes,
is,
yes.
it is an Achilles heel for the United States, and we can't allow that to be used against us, especially for what many consider to be seditious activity. And I also would question what progress means, or what, you know, that reforms are taking place at what level. I mean, you know, they might change one word in that sentence, and of course they reformed the sentence, I guess, in the classic, very strict constructionist sense. But from the greater sense of the spirit of it, it's not getting the job done. It's not getting done quickly enough for us. And what they do in their country, quite honestly, and quite frankly, from my opinion, that's their business. But what they do in our country is our business.
Yeah, no, your points are very valid. One thing I would say is, in addition to eliminating negative content, one of the things we have found, and we just took a quick glance, there's the addition of very positive content that sort of works in the other direction. I don't know to what extent they are constrained by this needing to keep their religious establishment on board, because that's where they get their authority from, is from the religious establishment. That's part of the pact. So it's a difficult walk that they're making. The people that I have worked with, I'm 1,000% convinced are very sincere, and in fact, one
With
of
the
them.
chairman's indulgence, I agree. In their country, it's inexorably linked since they came to power, the House of Saud, and I get all that and why they need to do all the things they need to do. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. However, in this country, none of it's appropriate.
Right.
None of it's appropriate, and we should take action. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Congressman Wolf, I have a question for you first, and then I'll let you make a comment, because I know you want to talk about the last question. ISIS used Saudi Arabian textbooks up until 2015. That was 2 years ago. And now they use their own textbooks. Would you like to comment on where ISIS got their textbooks to begin with?
Well, you're right. In the New York Times piece, it said, in a huge embarrassment to the Saudi authorities, the Islamic State adopted official Saudi textbooks for its schools until the extremist group could publish its own textbooks in 2015. Secondly, when I was in 2 years ago, we went up into the Nineveh Plains. We went into meetings with all the different people. At every meeting, I said, tell me, who's helping the Saudis, rather, who's helping ISIS? And every meeting, two came up, some three, but two came up. The Saudis, not always the Saudi government, but Saudi individuals, and he sort of alluded to the renegade guy. Secondly, Qatar. They were aiding and abetting ISIS. And there was another country, Turkey, who for the longest period of time was allowing people, they go to Istanbul, they call it the telephone number, they go south and they join. They may have changed, but don't forget, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia. The number of people from my area who were killed in the attack on the Pentagon, the guys who did it, Saudi Arabia. And so I think what this committee has done today with the hearing, the textbooks are important, but all these issues, and you push and you push and you push, and I urge you to meet with the new ambassador. And I urge you to sit down with him or whoever it is and pressure them. And the new religious freedom ambassador, I think you may have started something here. And the real danger is, you even recall last year, I read the 28 pages. You remember last year the issue came up? The Saudis hired law firms and PR firms in this town to do everything. Fortunately, the Congress, to its good credit, passed it and was not influenced. But you know what's going on, so by this hearing, you can cover all the textbooks are important, but terrorism is important. All these things are very, very important, and hopefully this can be the genesis if you guys, men and women, continue to really make a difference and stop what Saudi Arabia has been doing for a long period of time.
Thank you, and the ranking member and I will request a meeting with the ambassador, and we'll go from there, maybe have a hearing in the future on Qatar, and have all of you back. And I want to have one last question for all four of you. Since we're talking about textbooks and schools, how would you rank at this time, the goal of changing the textbooks so that they don't preach hate, intolerance, and violence? And it's real simple. It's not pass or fail. It's A, B, C, D, or F? Do you understand the question, Ms. Shay? How would you rank what Saudi Arabia is doing right now?
F.
F. All right, Dr. Weinberg.
F with credit for effort.
F with credit for effort. Okay. Congressman Wolf.
F plus.
Dr. Johnston.
I would give it a D. And one of the things I would point out is that as long as we're, buying 150 billion or selling 150 billion dollars worth of arms to the Saudis, they're not going to pay a whole lot of attention to Western criticism. When you couple that reality with the line they're walking with the religious establishment, I think that they are making as much progress as one could hope for at this point in time. We need to do a lot better, but there is sincere desire to do better on their part, the
And we-
government's part. I don't know about the other.
And without belaboring the point, if we take Ms. Shay's recommendation, we tie defense contracts to Saudi Arabia with the repairing of their textbooks. That may get somebody's attention. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of the people in the audience for being here as well. And this subcommittee is adjourned.